Well, hey, thanks everybody for joining. We'll get started here. Thanks for being here. Probably I should introduce myself. My name's Mike Schutt. I'm the executive director of Worldview Academy. This is our monthly Worldview Conversation. Thanks for jumping on and joining us. Our guest today is Dr. Tracy McKenzie. He's a professor of history at Wheaton College, and he's the Arthur F. Holmes Chair of Faith and Learning at Wheaton. That is a program designed to integrate Christian faith and learning how we think Christianly in our disciplines. And one of the reasons that I wanted Dr. McKenzie to talk to us at this time of year was because one of my favorite books on Christian history is a book called The First Thanksgiving: What the Real Story Tells Us About Loving God and Learning from History. This is the book. I've had it since 2013, read it when it came out. Dr. McKenzie received his undergraduate training at the University of Tennessee. I don't know if he's still a Vols fan. I didn't ask him that very divisive question, but he earned his MA and PhD at Vanderbilt. Dr. McKenzie, hey, thanks so much for being on to talk about your book and Christian history. We're grateful that you're here.
Thank you, Mike. I look forward to it. I'm glad to have the conversation.
One of the things that Dr. McKenzie says on his website is that his passion is being in conversations with other Christians about the love of God, the life of the mind, and the study of the past and how they intersect. This is in the sweet spot for Worldview Academy and our families. And I think it's a really, really great topic. Thinking Christianly about the past. How can we do that faithfully? So I'm just going to kick it off and say, why did you write this book? What was behind the thinking and writing about the first Thanksgiving?
Well, great question, Mike. You've sort of anticipated some of what I will say. It really grew out of an evolving sense of calling. When I first began as a professor a long time ago, for the most part, I was responding to questions that the secular academy thought were the most important things to be concerned with, and I would just jumped right in. And that became increasingly unsatisfying over time. I would sit by individuals in church and they would ask me what I was working on, and I would have to honestly think to myself, you would not find this interesting or relevant or important in any way. And over time, the weight of that really began to weigh me down because I realized I had an opportunity to write more for the church and I wasn't seizing that opportunity. So over time, I've come to think of my own sense of calling as to remember the past and to remind the church. And in particular, I long to be in conversation with Christians about how to remember faithfully. I mean, I think as Christians, we're called to remember. We are part of a historical faith. We are members of a historical church. But it's not just a natural thing to automatically remember faithfully. And so I like to be able to talk with people about both the blessings that come from studying the past and some of the pitfalls that might be there as well.
That's pretty great. So, well, do we want to start? Well, let's start with that. What are the blessings of studying the past? Why do you think it's important for Christians? Obviously, families on this call and families concerned about thinking well. Why? Why should we think well about the past? What do you see as the primary
So there's a really long answer to that. I'm not going to give you that one, but I'll hit some high points. Paul enjoins us not to be conformed to the world in Romans chapter 12. And he tells us in his letter to the Corinthians, second letter, to take every thought captive to obedience to Christ. And one of the things that I really feel dogmatically as a historian is that when we live our lives largely confined to the present moment, one historian talks about being stranded in the present. When we live our lives cut off from other times, the likelihood that we are being conformed to the cultural values of our moment in time goes up astronomically. The reality is, one of the things that historical study does is it gives us a place to stand to sort of look at our particular cultural moment from a different vantage point. The things that are so ubiquitous that they just become invisible to us suddenly become more obvious. We're able to see ourselves more clearly.
Mm.
By ourselves, we cannot see ourselves clearly. And even you might think, oh, but I have my Bible. I can always look at our culture from that point. But I think if we're honest with ourselves, we know that our particular culture also can inform the way we read Scripture. And so it's really important for us, I think, to have that perspective, to stand at other times when particular Christians who had devout faith oftentimes thought of themselves and of their society, of their political system, and so forth in very different ways. So I actually think it's critical to discipleship. I think we cannot take every thought captive if there are certain thoughts that we're not even aware that are shaping us. We can't resist being conformed to the world if we're not aware of other ways of thinking from other times. So I would start right there. I think historical ignorance is dangerous to the Christian. It's not a historical study is not a luxury. I really think it's a necessity.
Wow. Well, I was going to ask you about the barriers and the pitfalls, but instead, I'm just going to say, how do you see what you've just said playing out in how we view and study the first Thanksgiving? I think that's a lot of your first 4 or 5 chapters of that
Yeah,
book is talking about what we've done well, what we've done poorly, and why it matters, and using the first Thanksgiving as an example
yeah,
for this.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's a great question, Mike. One of the things I want to I stress, I think, up front is I didn't write the book just to sort of puncture bubbles, burst bubbles, to sort of uh, expose myths. There's a place for that, but that wasn't my goal. I believe that when we encounter the past more as it was, we actually are blessed by it more. We're challenged by it more. We learn from it more, and that's why I think it's so important. So when you think about the memory of the first Thanksgiving, it's just so natural. It is human nature that we look at the past through the eyes of the present. And one of the things that comes from that is, even though we don't intend it, we're not conscious of doing it. We tend to imagine these people from the past, as I put it in the book, as if they were neighbors wearing funny clothes. That they might look a little bit different, but basically, they're just like we are. They see the world exactly the same way. They practice their faith more or less the same way when we get down to it. And the reality is, what we're often doing is imputing our values to them, which means that we don't learn really very much from them because they already agree with us in every respect. But when we take their own word at face value, we see that they're different from us in so many ways. They're far less individualistic. Their commitment to the church is really such, I think, that it puts most 21st century Christians to shame. Um, they were willing to risk themselves, to gamble their lives on their faith in ways that many of us would blanch to think about, it seems to me. One of the examples I give in the book is the way that we tell the story of why they migrated to New England. And it sometimes disturbs us to hear this. But the Pilgrims really didn't migrate to America primarily in search of religious liberty. And we have to be really careful how we explain that. They absolutely valued religious liberty. And that is why they migrated from England to Holland. But in Holland, they tell us they experienced wonderful religious liberty and really believed in many ways that their church was flourishing. But there were other ways that they were not. So when they ultimately decide to migrate, William Bradford, who writes about the Plymouth colony, he says it had much more to do with their concerns about living in a permissive culture, raising children that they believed were being molded by a culture that they didn't really think was biblically centered. They had a hard time um, putting food on the table. They were really often on the verge of starvation because of their circumstances there. And I mention in the book that I think that changes how we remember them. I liken it to Jesus' story of the parable of the sower. And we've always said that what the pilgrims were struggling with in Holland was persecution. And instead, I think they were much more concerned with what Jesus said in that parable were the cares of this world. And the reason I think that's so important, I think it makes the pilgrims more relevant to us. Not too many American Christians today really suffer persecution, know that they might be thrown into jail if they use the wrong Bible, even. But most of us are concerned about raising our families, concerned about the cultural influences around us, maybe having economic concerns. And in that respect, we can relate to the Pilgrims much more. The story that we don't tell turns out to be, I think, much more relevant than the story that we do tell.
That's that to me that was one of the big revelations of the book. But just knowing the history, right? They left and it doesn't take anything away from the Pilgrims to see them with the right eyes. They stood on conviction and left England as separatists because they believed they couldn't worship the way they wanted to in England, but they could in Holland.
Mhm.
And yet they weren't able to practice the trades that they had. They weren't welcome in the culture, and they're sending their kids off into communities that were teaching them bad habits. They were worried about their kids. They were worried about the corrupting influences of a surrounding culture. I mean, that I agree with you. That is so much more. It's so much more a compelling uh, sort of a like-mindedness with where we are today as Christians concerned about the surrounding culture than the larger question. But it doesn't take anything away from the Pilgrims. So, could you say a few words about, because I think this goes back to a bigger theme of, look, when we study history and we study it well, we can learn from the Pilgrims. And what you and I have exchanged an email or two where you said, hey, we can't miss, what is it that we can learn from these people if we understand them well? Could you maybe talk a little bit about, okay, when we think about the Pilgrims, what do they say to us?
It's a great question. And I think they say a lot of things. And I like the distinction that you're making, Mike. I like to challenge my students to not only learn about, but to learn from,
Hmm.
which is an important distinction. And it's not that everyone we're going to encounter in the past automatically has some deep moral insight that we lack, but we want to be open to that. One of the ways I've seen that described is just to remind ourselves that there are always gifts to be received from the past if we have eyes to see them. So when it comes to the Pilgrims, I think a variety of things. Their commitment to the church. One of the things that we just lose sight of, maybe it's just because it's so obvious, when they're concerned about the influences of the culture in Holland, when they're concerned about the economic challenges that they face, they don't respond to that individually. They don't each sort of go their own way and figure out how to make do. They want to relocate as a church. They have a bond to one another that says, if one suffers, all are suffering, and all need to respond. And I just think that's hugely convicting. Uh, I think, one of the things that we could learn from the Pilgrims is absolutely a forest for the trees sort of thing. That's the name. We've come to Pilgrims just now as the label that we slap on this group, and you say the word Pilgrims, and you imagine people wearing, big tall black hats and silver buckles, but when William Bradford says they knew they were pilgrims, as they were leaving Holland, he's thinking about the book of Hebrews. He's thinking about individuals who say there is another country that we're seeking, that in some sense this world is not our permanent home. And so their very self-conscious identity as pilgrims on the path to heaven as their ultimate destination. Um, that's something that we just totally lose because
Yeah.
we've so trivialized the terminology that they use. So
Yeah.
that'd be two examples.
Those are two great examples. We don't see ourselves so much as pilgrims as we should in a different country. You do talk a lot about the hardships of what they faced and the brutal winter and losing more than half their number or about half their number when they started. This was a commitment to a vision for a community. So maybe expand a little bit on the first point you made about how they saw the church as a church and they saw the Christian faith as a communal a thing more than we do. They were not, you used the word, they were not individualistic. They saw God's plan and providence worked out in family, community, and the congregation. Can you expand a little bit on what we can learn from them about that?
Yes, I mean, I would just start by building on what you've said, which is they think of the building block of the society in those three institutions: family, civil society, church. And in fact, they would say that your identity, sort of your situation, is defined by your connection to those groups, not as an individual. One of the things that I think is so interesting is when the first laws are sort of codified in Plymouth in 1627. One of the things we learn is that the colony didn't allow single adult males to live alone. If you were on your own, no, not yet married, you would be placed in a family because they simply didn't think it was healthy spiritually as much as anything else for people not to be integrated into a community. So they think of that very strongly. They think in terms of individual liberty very differently than we do. I mean, our culture typically thinks of individual liberty as just the freedom to do anything without restriction or restraint. And they're thinking of liberty always in terms of the freedom to fulfill one's obligations, the freedom one to serve God in truth, to love your neighbor fully as yourself. In terms of political rights, they think in terms of obligations, really more than they think in terms of individual prerogatives. So if you are eligible to vote in Plymouth and do not vote, there's a fine. If you're elected to be a governor and you say no, thank you, I don't think I'm interested, there's a fine. I mean, the idea is this is not a choice. This is one of the callings that God imposes on you. If you're a resident of a civil society, that comes with a calling that involves obligations. Now, could they have overdone it? Do we think that they're right in all respects? I'm not saying that, but it's just such a different worldview than what we take for granted in our culture. It at very least sort of causes us to step back and sort of look at that with a new perspective.
It really does. That's great examples. And I do love you saying they could have been wrong. They might have overdone it. But to know, in order to make that judgment, we probably ought to see what it was instead of seeing them just like ourselves. One of the areas that you talk about that has sort of some implications for sort of our myth making of Thanksgiving is their view of celebrations and Thanksgivings, public
Mhm.
holidays. That maybe this first Thanksgiving wasn't actually a Thanksgiving in the sense that we have projected it, but there probably was a Thanksgiving at some point as we would have thought of it later on. Can you talk about that a bit? I think that's an interesting sort of application of what you're saying too.
Yes. So it sort of starts with terminology, and we have to understand that the Pilgrims thought of a Thanksgiving as genuinely a holiday, which meant literally a holy day. And their understanding from Scripture was that there was no commandment in Scripture to have an annual or otherwise regular holy day of Thanksgiving. What they saw modeled in Scripture was what they would have defined as an occasional or a providential day of Thanksgiving. What they meant by that was they would say there are times when a church or a community is clearly under really the chastising of God. They're suffering in some way from disease or war or drought. And in those moments, it's important to humble oneself and have a day of humiliation and fasting, they would have called, where you're pleading with God for his mercy and deliverance. And then there are going to be instances where God has, in a powerful way, intervened to deliver his people from disease or from war or from other kinds of challenges. And when that happens, they would have said the scripture calls for us to have particular or occasional days of Thanksgiving. And those Thanksgiving days would have been centered in the church, not in the home. They would have been centered around worship and prayer and singing, not celebrating with enormous meals. In fact, we'd probably think a Thanksgiving, as they would understand it, would be a pretty tedious, not particularly all that fun kind of occasion. But that doesn't mean that they couldn't enjoy themselves because they saw absolutely good in celebration. They just didn't consider that a Thanksgiving. And so, as I say in the book, their first Thanksgiving, as they understood it, was not in the fall of 1621 when they celebrate the harvest. Rather, in 1623, so now we're 3 years into their settlement, their storehouses are not full. There begins to be a serious drought in the late spring of 1623. And by midsummer, there has not been rain for 2 months. And they believe absolutely that the colony is facing starvation within a few months. And so they have a day of humiliation and fasting before the Lord, as they would put it. One of the Pilgrim accounts says that their service lasted for 9 hours, and that when that service began, there was not a cloud in the sky. That by the time the service was over, the sky had darkened over, and that a gentle rain began to fall that evening, and it continued for 14 days. And it
That's
revived the crops, and they were able to survive with more than enough. And they said, if we're going to appeal to God for his mercy publicly, we need to thank God for his deliverance publicly. So they call for a second time of worship and praise, this probably in the end of July 1623. And from their definition, that was their first Thanksgiving. We don't remember that anymore simply because we really don't think of Thanksgiving in the same way. We always remember that first autumn celebration.
That's so it's so interesting. And and maybe let's go to the work of the historian, right? This isn't work that we would do ordinarily, but rely on academics or historians who care about looking for actual evidence. You mentioned in the book that much of what how we see the first Thanksgiving is imagined.
Yeah.
Uh, it's in we've made it up because despite the vast evidence we have about the Pilgrims, they wrote so much about themselves. We have letters, we have historical documents, we have I forget what you say, 3 sentences or 1 sentence on this actual event. Uh, what happened? And well, we'll talk about the evidence first,
Yeah.
and then maybe talk about what happened.
Sure. So there is, as you've put it, there's a kind of paradox. There is a lot of evidence about the Plymouth colony, but almost nothing about what we today call the first Thanksgiving. Um, in terms of records, the entirety of what we have is I think it's 4 sentences, if I'm remembering correctly. I do remember it's a total of 115 words.
Wow.
It was basically a paragraph in a letter home written by one of the adult members of the Pilgrim colony, a man named Edward Winslow. And it gets incorporated into a kind of pamphlet that was published in London in 1622 to publicize the venture to try to get more people involved, maybe more financial backing. Only a few copies were probably ever printed, and it was largely lost. And then rediscovered one copy in the year 1841, so about 220 years later. And so one of the interesting things is Thanksgiving is celebrated in New England pretty much from about the 1670s on every year. Every colony is issuing a proclamation of Thanksgiving during that period. I have never found a single mention of the quote first Thanksgiving or the Pilgrims. They weren't remembered until that document was discovered. But all that document basically says is that after a good harvest, the governor sent some members out to hunt fowl, and that the neighboring Wampanoag Indians show up and bring 5 deer, and that they celebrated for about 3 days. And that's about it. But over time, once that is discovered, people just begin to run with that. And it's not malicious, it's not malevolent. They're just filling in the gaps, and they're filling in the gaps by imagining what they think it must have been like, but from the vantage point of more than 2 centuries later. And they really don't have any understanding of the early 1600s. So you have novels, you have plays, you have songs being written, and they're just mostly imagined.
Wow. So interesting. Uh and maybe just for our listeners, I mean, the point of thinking about this faithfully is not to discourage us from eating turkey and not deer. Right? The idea is let's think about what we can learn from the actual history. We can still appreciate our practices that have more to do maybe with football than they have to do with the relationship between the Pilgrims and the Indians. And you do some of the cultural work on how Thanksgiving Day has been built up into our national identity. Well, and maybe this is a good place maybe I'm just reminding myself of this would be a good thing to talk about. But you talk about our religious identity, our national religious identity, and then our identity as Christians as it relates to our national identity. And sometimes those overlap in really great ways, and sometimes they're fraught with, well, problems. Could you talk a little bit about that relationship? I don't have my notes exactly. Here it is. You said that how we remember this reveals a great deal about how we understand our religious heritage as Americans and our national heritage as Christians. Those were the words
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
looking for. I think that's a really important conversation. What do you think?
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that question. And that actually sort of takes us back to part of the reason that I was drawn to the project in the first place. One of the things that, as a historian, I think I have learned over the years is that it's very much human nature for us to be tempted to define our identity in on a foundation other than our primary relation to Christ as Lord. And so sometimes that will be to relate our identity as Christians to our national identity. There are other ways, but it's very common. And One of the advantages of studying Thanksgiving is that it is actually, whether we think of it this way or not, it is a civil holiday. It has been promoted by the state or by the federal government, not fundamentally by the churches, although churches may endorse it. It's a civil holiday, but it's a holiday that we impute a lot of religious significance to. We think of it in some sense, or most Christians do, as having a religious dimension. So by going back and studying it, we can think about how those two things get sort of interwoven. And one of the things that has struck me is that it's been very important for modern Christians in America over the years to remember the Pilgrims as devout Christians, which they were, and to emphasize then that their Thanksgiving celebration was fundamentally a religious holiday. And we emphasize that as a way to sort of assert the importance of Christianity in our culture today. And my point would be that in doing that, we're imputing a belief to the event that they did not have, and we're not hearing them challenge us in the ways that they could challenge us very constructively. And I think that's almost always the case when we, unbeknownst to ourselves, impute our values to the past. We miss hearing the things that would challenge us. And often, I hate to put it this way, but we're not being entirely loving to the pilgrims when we misrepresent them, when we impute values to them that they did not hold. And that's been sort of an American tradition since about the 1840s. And I do share that in the book. Every generation has sort of remembered the Pilgrims a little bit differently so that they can perpetually be heroes, even as American values have been changing and changing and changing.
Yeah. You do make a distinction on that point. That reminds me, you make a distinction between heroes and idols. And there's something in that on this question of uh, sanctifying a civic holiday, knowing that, well, say a few words about that, and maybe I'll jump in.
Yeah, I have an entire chapter that I call Heroes Not Idols. Um, a lot of secular historians would sort of look askance, maybe even sneer at the idea of finding heroes in the past. I actually think that we have encouragement from Scripture. I mean, Paul talks about imitate. He says, "Imitate me as I imitate Christ." I think it's a good thing when we discover individuals in our lives or in our past that model virtues that we want to imitate. But as John Calvin said, in our fallenness, our minds are a perpetual forge of idols. We're sort of constantly tempted to take good things and make them into ultimate things. And I think that can be true in identifying people that we admire in the past. And so the sort of path that we want to walk is one in which we can appreciate and be grateful for those role models that we encounter, but never cross the line into imputing intrinsic authority to them or seeing them as infallible in some way. One of the ways that I illustrate that in the book is I talk about a monument in Plymouth today called the Monument to the Forefathers which is rarely seen. It's a few blocks away from the coast. I don't think tourists get there as frequently, but it's this massive monument to the Pilgrims that really sort of puts them in togas and makes them look like Greek gods. And as I say in the book, I think if William Bradford could come back today, I think he would tear his clothes and cry out in grief, "What are you doing? We are humans just as you are." And so I think we want to remember those that propensity to create idols, or to just look on the past with contempt. And we want to be able, with discernment, to identify what is positive without having to make these figures into sort of infallible idols.
And they, in order for them to be great and to be heroes and to be worthy of being imitated in the good things that they did and the bad things that they did, we we don't need to remake them,
Yeah.
right? We can see them as they are and still appreciate what they've done. And apart from them, apart from what the first Thanksgiving was or is, was, uh, we still can celebrate in our way, right? To realize, well, we're different than the Pilgrims, and so we're doing something a little different. But to connect the two can be fraught. I think part of the, and maybe going back to your earlier point about how each generation imagines, and then the monument itself, we use, and this is your phrase, we use history for ammunition
Mhm.
rather than as illumination. I think that's a central, maybe worldview principle for any student, any scholar. What are you using your discipline for? How are you thinking about the world? Is it to justify something that you are trying to justify regardless of the truth? Or are you learning in a humble orientation toward the past or towards the law or towards medicine, whatever your discipline?
Mhm.
Um, maybe you can. I guess you've given quite a few examples of that, but can you expand a little bit on that idea of how we use disciplines, how we use history as ammunition rather than illumination?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's important. I want to stress to everyone that's listening, I don't think Christians are the primary or the sole offenders here. I think it's a temptation to all humans, that oftentimes we look to figures in the past and we imagine them as sort of allies in some kind of contest or debate or struggle that we're currently involved in. And so we want to recruit them. I joke that it's like the political ads before the election day. We want the Pilgrims to show up and say, we're the Pilgrims and we endorse this message," or something like that. We
Yep.
want them to agree with us. Here's the fundamental thing. I think if we take it back to our Christian foundations, Augustine, among other Christian thinkers, have said when we relate to other human beings, we're going to be tempted to one of two paths. One would be to enjoy them for their intrinsic preciousness, created in the image of God. The other would be to use them for how they can benefit us. And I think that's true in every relationship. Hopefully, it's the kind of thing that in God's mercy, as He sanctifies us, that becomes less and less true, but the temptation is always there. And what I'm pointing out in terms of historical thought is that we are really sort of tempted to use figures from the past, even if that's not conscious. What attracts us to them is, hey, here's someone that I think is important. And boy, he actually agrees with me on this point. All right? And of course, that increases our admiration for them a
Yeah,
lot.
right.
So it
That's a
doesn't it
really great
doesn't have to
historical
be
figure.
conscious. I'm not saying that we're setting out to sort of misrepresent. I'm just saying that we're naturally drawn to what looks like something that is our value, and particularly if it seems to reinforce what we believe, we're not going to work really hard to make sure that we have proved that this is true.
I love it. Well, and I'm grateful that you said it's not just Christians that do this. This is human nature,
Yeah.
and I'm glad you said that because it occurs to me, right? Our hagiography or our embellishment of the first Thanksgiving has led to embellishments contrary to our values, right? Like the whole movement, I don't know, 6 years ago, where kids in school, it was emphasized that the Pilgrims in the first Thanksgiving weren't actually thanking God; they were thanking the Indians.
Mhm.
Right? There's no more that is just as clearly imagined as the fact that
Absolutely.
the Pilgrims gave a religious feast in 1621. Right? Both are imagined to meet the ends, that to give the ammunition for our cultural agenda,
Yeah.
rather than thinking clearly about what actually happened. And maybe this is a good place. I want to go down a rabbit trail that I think you started here on history, but I want to give you a chance to talk maybe a little bit about the relationship between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag
Mhm.
Indians, just generally, and then maybe even at the in those first years of interaction.
Yeah. I can make just a few broad generalizations and say that there's ditches on both sides of the road. One ditch would be that the relationship was um, immediately sort of warm and fuzzy and in a sort of a illustration of a multicultural 21st century celebration. The ditch on the other side of the road was that it was absolutely antagonistic from the starting point and ultimately led to immediately violence or even genocide. And you'll see some things like that sometimes online. Um, the relationship was fraught in the sense that it was tense. I mean, they had a lot of cultural difference to try to have to bridge, but largely they succeeded for several generations to live peacefully in coexistence. Now, one of the things you always want to remember is that the Wampanoag was just one of many Native American tribes in the area. So we don't want to talk about the Indians versus the Pilgrims because it was much more complicated than that. One of the things that had happened in the last, half century before the Pilgrims arrived was that there had been contact with European, probably fishermen primarily, that had introduced diseases into that area of North America that were not native to that area, and it had really devastated the Native American populations. So some of the tribes had weathered that better than others. It had really changed the balance of power among the different tribes. And so some of the tribes were pretty hostile to the Pilgrims from the beginning, but the Wampanoag were not. And it's going to be at least the 1670s before there is really any significant conflict with them.
Interesting. And they're the ones that brought the main protein dish
That's
to
right.
first Thanksgiving.
That's right.
The first, no, the feast that we think of now as the first Thanksgiving. Uh, I, I do want to talk more about the question of reflection. You talk about moral judgment, moral reflection, and it's caught up in how we see God's providence in history as well. Maybe those are, well, talk about how you see our we want to be virtuous in
Mhm.
how we interact with the
Mhm.
past, and so we
Yeah.
want to have good reflection, and we want to make sound judgments. How does that happen for
Oh man, that's a great question, and I think it's such an important one. We mentioned earlier the distinction between learning about and learning from. And I think learning from should be always a conscious objective that we have when we study the past. It's not always going to apply, but we should be open to that. And so, what I encourage in the book is to pursue what I call moral reflection as opposed to moral judgment, where moral judgment is basically appraising the behavior that we see in others or the ideas that we find in others from the past. In other words, it's outward directed. Whereas moral reflection is basically, it's sort of like the psalmist who says, "Search me, O God, and know my thoughts and show me my heart." Sort of what we're asking. I tell students that we want to ask at least three questions anytime we go to the past. We want to say, how is my encounter with the past helping me to understand myself? How is my encounter with the past helping me to understand the culture I inhabit? And how is the engagement with the past, does it require anything of me? In other words, has it exposed something in my own heart that I then want to ask the Holy Spirit or go to Scripture and allow it to sort of reshape my thinking and my behavior. So this is not a perfect analogy, but you know that there's a point in the Gospels where Jesus is walking with his disciples on the road, and he says, who do men say that I am? And then who do you say that I am? I think we might get in the habit when we encounter people from the past in so many words, inviting them to answer that question about us. In other words, say to William Bradford, how do you see me? So that the burden of proof is not always on the past to sort of justify their behavior. But we're sort of turning that around and saying, in so many words, letting William Bradford say, prove to me that your particular way is more scripturally grounded than mine.
Right.
And I just think that's a different habit. It's cultivating humility to begin with, and it's also open to the possibility that there's going to be some blind spots that get exposed when we study history, and we want to act on that.
Man, that's pretty great. To it requires us to think, right? It requires us to have a moral imagination, which is
Mm,
really, really helpful to develop in conversations on any cultural topic as well. I love that. As we think as Christians, and there's a good question in the chat, and I want to go to that next. But first, I want to ask, as we think about, and you do a little bit of this you do actually a lot of this in the book, but as we think about uh, providential history, God is God is in charge. He is sovereign. And so we know that his hand is present in the things of the past. How can we be careful knowing that to be true, but also knowing that fallen human beings are at work and we can't read into history everything that we want to read, and we can't
mhm.
always know or discern God's motives for allowing, permitting, or directing.
Right.
How do we live as Christians thinking about the past when we know that God is at work and we want
Yeah.
to be faithful to give him praise, and yet we want to be careful in how we do that?
Man, that's a wonderful question. That's a big one. Um, I'm glad that you asked it. The answer can be sometimes disturbing to us. I absolutely believe with all my being that God is working out all things according to the counsel of his will. So we start right there. That, though, is different from saying that God, in any sense, has promised to his followers that we can read his motive in current events or in historical events that are not being discussed explicitly in scriptural revelation. So, one of the things we want to keep in mind is that when, say, the book of First Kings or Second Kings or the Chronicles, when they talk about why this king is raised up and this one brought low, or this battle turns out this way or a different way, and why, we're reading inspired scripture, a God breathed scripture. When we read William Bradford's account of Plymouth Plantation, we're not reading something that is divinely inspired in that same sense. And so it can sort of trouble us, but the Bible is not always a model for human historical research that's not part of divine revelation. I think it's important for us to remember that the verse I always go back to, Deuteronomy 29:29, the secret things belong to the Lord our God. Those things which are revealed belong to us and to our children forever. So we always want to make the distinction between what is God revealed and where is he not. And so God clearly revealed why he raises up David to replace Saul, for example. There's nothing in the Bible that tells us explicitly what his plan for Plymouth Plantation in 1621 was. And so there's a tightrope that we have to walk, both acknowledging God's sovereignty and being asking ourselves what God might be about here, what might be his purposes for this or that, but always stopping short of a dogmatic declaration of the mind of God. At least as historians, if someone says, God has given me a word, in essence, sort of a prophetic insight, that's something else. But me as a historian reading the historical documents, if I say this is what God was doing, I'm not acting as a historian as much as I am as a prophet. If I could just say one other word, I'd encourage your audience to read Bradford's History of Plymouth Plantation.
Yeah.
It is a wonderful example of the tightrope I'm talking about. The Pilgrims believed that everything that happened to them was exactly the manifestation of the will of God in their lives. They never doubted that. And so, one of the most common phrases in the history is, it pleased God to, or it pleased God that. This is
Mm.
clearly God's will, they're saying. But they're not going to presume to know at that moment exactly what God's purposes were. Clearly, if it happened, it was God's will. Why God wanted, how it fit into his larger framework, they don't actually say that. And I admire that. I admire their ability to walk that fine line.
That's really good. The the Bradford history is lays out this the earlier um, point that you make about why did the Pilgrims really come to the New World? It's crystal clear in Bradford's words about their concern for their children, cultural corruption, the thing that I think we have so much to learn about. They were willing to sacrifice a lot for realizing that they had lost a cultural battle for the hearts of the souls of their kids. It's a big deal,
Mhm.
and Bradford makes that pretty clear. That's a great answer on on this tension. I think that's really good. And okay, one more thing before we get to the question, because you reminded me of something else that you say early on in the book, and that is, don't be troubled by the fact that we have to interpret. Historians interpret
Mhm.
history. That's another reason that we don't just take our views. It's always filtered through an interpretation somehow of events. We don't get the events unfiltered from our own interpretation.
Yeah. No, that's exactly true. And again, that's another thing that sometimes makes us a little bit uncomfortable. But the way I put it to my students, the facts never speak for themselves. If you know that old saying, just let the facts speak for themselves, they don't. How they fit together into a coherent story that's meaningful requires hard work and interpretation. And because it requires interpretation, it'll always be fallible, right? So you can imagine there are some facts, I'm not a relativist. There are some facts that are just wrong, and some facts are true. But when we say, how do the facts fit together? There's not one and one only definitive way that's obvious, which means every work of historical scholarship involves some interpretation. And I think that means for me as a historian, I want to be humble about my own findings because I'm sure they're flawed in some way. And we want to be charitable more than we sometimes are to differing interpretations, and at least a little more, I guess, modest about our own, because they all have that, element of interpretation in them.
Super good, super good. And your admonition to look at the historical context where everything is connected. Everything is connected, and you can't see the infinite connections and causes of every event. So our interpretation, it has to be limited unless we have a God's eye view of it.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, here's the question in the chat, and I think it's an opportunity to talk about something else you talk in the book that we haven't addressed, but also to explain, to give an answer to this great question. It says, we homeschool and our kids are currently preparing a Thanksgiving presentation for our co-op and for our family gathering on Thanksgiving. What is your encouragement or advice in how we present this? I was hoping to connect our thanks to God today with the pilgrim thanks to God for his faithful provision. Are you suggesting that we need to be more careful how we make that connection? Thanks so much. That's a great question. Thanks, Coral, for that. That's beautiful.
Yeah. Well, that is a that is a great question. I give an anecdote in the book where I was invited to be like a chapel speaker at a Christian elementary school. And I was going to share from my research on the first Thanksgiving. And just before I go on stage, comes out like the first and second grade choir, all wearing their little pilgrim costumes and so forth. Not very historically accurate, I might say. But in that moment, my job was not to tell those little children that they weren't dressed as the pilgrims actually would have dressed and so forth. I think, first of all, I would say that the American Thanksgiving holiday as it's celebrated now, uh, can be a wonderful blessing for those who celebrate it. So I don't want to say that we shouldn't do that. I do just want to suggest that we be more aware of how much the way that we remember that event is largely imagined and how much we miss that we might gain because of that. Um, I have two daughters that were homeschooled all the way through high school, and we have pictures of them from when they're like 4 and 7, and they're both dressed up in Native American costumes, and their 2.5-year-old brother is dressed up like a pilgrim. And so, I mean, we did all of that. I honestly think that if I know what I know now and we're going back to be the father of small children, I would not celebrate Thanksgiving in November the way that we do, but I would look for opportunities to add the kind of celebration that the Pilgrims would have called their true first Thanksgiving, which is to say, as a father, I've often remembered or often thought, wouldn't it have been wonderful if there had been a particular challenge that our family faced, illness or a loss of a job or a death of a loved one, or anything like that, where we would pray to God for his deliverance from the trial. And then when we saw God's provision, sort of as the, governor of our family, I would declare, we're going to have a holiday. We're going to be spontaneous. We're going to celebrate because I think that actually sort of trains us to have this expectation of God's intervention in regular ways throughout the fabric of our lives that perhaps that annual experience doesn't quite capture as much. It certainly is wonderful to reflect on what God has done in the past year, but to train the children to be looking for God's provision and responding to it with gratitude, I think can be a pretty neat thing.
That's good. I like that answer. There's nothing necessary. There's nothing wrong with the Thanksgiving that we have, and to set aside a day that's connected to our national identity, that's connected to lots of other things to say we're giving thanks to God. And the Pilgrims too did give thanks. They
Mhm.
just did it in a little bit different way than we sometimes remember it. I think that's a good encouraging thought. I love that. And maybe it's that we add, as you suggest, some of the ways the Pilgrims really did give thanks to our cultural and family practices. That's pretty cool. I like that a lot. One question is, what about Squanto? We hear about Squanto all the time. What's the real story with him? You mind talking about that?
Just, I can sort of briefly, his story is complicated. I mean, you're probably picking up on that. My students joke, and if I ask a question in class, they always raise their hands and say it's
It's
complicated. They've
complicated.
learned that that's what they're supposed to start their answer with. Squanto's story was complicated. I mentioned to you before that the exposure of European disease had really had a major adverse effect on Native American groups in New England. And one of those groups was Squanto's tribe. He was a Patuxent Indian by birth. He was born into that tribe. And then he actually is kidnapped when he's a young adult by I think it's a French sea captain who sells him into slavery in Europe. And so he is taken out of North America for a period of years. And during the time that he was away, his tribe gets completely eradicated by disease. He's actually able to escape, to make his way on I think it's now an English vessel back to New England, goes overland, finally gets back to the Plymouth area. It's an incredible story. And he finds that none of his people are still living. And he's actually basically taken prisoner by the Wampanoag. So he is living with the Wampanoag, but they do not think of him as one of theirs. And so Squanto actually sees the arrival of the Pilgrims and his efforts to sort of ingratiate himself with them as a way to sort of create some more space for himself, maybe a little bit more leverage with the Wampanoag. But he actually is probably duplicitous. One of the things that William Bradford tells us is that Squanto was telling the Wampanoag that the Pilgrims kept the same disease that had wiped out the Patuxent, that they kept that disease in a barrel underneath their storehouse, and that Squanto had the sort of leverage with them to determine whether they would unleash that disease on the Wampanoag or not. And when Bradford discovers this, he says it's clear that Squanto was playing his own game. So Squanto was a blessing. Bradford says he believes that God provided him. He certainly helps them learn how to fertilize their crop and have a better yield. So he was a blessing in that sense. But his relationship with the Pilgrims was really complicated. And of course, that doesn't translate very well into the childhood sort of storybooks that
You're
we
killing
grew
us
up
here.
with.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
That's great. That's so good to know. And I mean, it's true of human nature. I mean, we look at politics and our great heroes that were presidents and politicians of the past. They were all pretty political.
Mm,
Shocking that would be true of politicians. And so it's not surprising that human beings acted like human beings. And it's
yeah.
cool to know that story actually. Um, Okay, so we're winding up on time here. I don't see any more questions, so maybe I'm going to give you the last word. And we started with this question, and I think you've answered it through this whole discussion. Thank you for that, by the way. This has been great. Uh, Maybe a last word on answering the questions that you let us off with. How have the Pilgrims blessed us?
Mm.
How would you wrap up for us as we go?
Well, I appreciate you asking the question. And what I absolutely would want your audience to believe is that I do think there are so many things that we can gain from our encounter with the Pilgrims that are very positive. They love their families. They love their Lord. They took seriously a kind of obligation to raise up a faithful new generation. And they risked everything they had. And one of the things that I don't think I stressed enough, they knew how dangerous the voyage to North America was. There had been other efforts where there had been shipwrecks or other sorts of catastrophes. They knew that the chances of dying would be great. They risked not only all their material possessions, they risked their very lives to try to create a better future and hopefully a more God-honoring future for the next generation. I think that's pretty cool.
It's pretty
And
cool.
so I don't mind, spending time with them and trying to get to know them and actually hear them in their human complexity, as opposed to the sort of two-dimensional, cardboard cutouts that we tend to think of.
That's awesome. What a great way to end too. Hey, thank you so much for doing this, for being with us. I really, as I told you, I think the book is very important. I loved it, but also this has been a great conversation. So thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's been an absolute privilege. And I'll say happy Thanksgiving to you and all your audience, and God bless you all.
Thank you. Thanks. For those of you who want to know more about Dr. McKenzie's work, his website is roberttracymckenzie.com. That's right, right? roberttracymckenzie.com. Lots of resources there. You can also find him on the Wheaton College page, Robert Tracy McKenzie. This book is The First Thanksgiving, and we'll be at camp at Wheaton, and camp registration is open for all of you folks who didn't join us early. Camp registration is already open online. The website is worldview.org. This conversation will be available on the website as well. Hey, thanks for joining us, everyone. Thanks to Dr. McKenzie. Have a great Thanksgiving.